The storm had torn through Colorado territory like the wrath of God himself, leaving destruction scattered across Daniel McKay's ranch like broken promises. Fence posts lay splintered, cattle huddled in whatever shelter they could find, and the normally gentle creek had swollen into a raging torrent that carved new channels through his land. Daniel emerged from his barn, rifle in hand, surveying the damage with the grim acceptance of a man who'd weathered too many disasters to count. That's when he heard it. A weak cry cutting through the howling wind, coming from somewhere near the flooded creek. He found her clinging to a fallen cottonwood branch in the rushing water, her dark hair plastered against her skull, her face ghostly pale in the storm's aftermath. Without hesitation, Daniel plunged into the freezing current, fighting against the water's fury to reach her before her strength gave out completely. The woman was barely conscious when he dragged her to shore, her body limp and frighteningly cold. Blood seeped from a gash across her forehead, and her left arm hung at an unnatural angle. But it was her eyes that worried him most, glassy and unfocused, the look of someone slipping away from the world. "Can you hear me?" Daniel asked, lifting her carefully in his arms. She was too light, as if she hadn't been eating properly for weeks. Her lips moved soundlessly at first, then formed words so quiet he had to lean close to catch them. "I won't make it through the night," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath against the wind. Daniel's jaw set with determination. He'd seen men give up before, watched the light fade from their eyes when they decided death was easier than fighting. Not this time. Not on his watch. "The hell you won't," he said firmly, adjusting his grip to carry her more securely toward his cabin. "I've got other plans for you." The trek back seemed endless, with Daniel moving as quickly as he dared while trying not to jostle his unconscious burden. The woman's breathing grew shallower with each step, her skin taking on the dangerous blue tinge of hypothermia. He was running out of time. His cabin was modest but solid, built to withstand harsh mountain winters. Daniel kicked open the door and headed straight for the fireplace, laying the woman on a thick bearskin rug. Within minutes, he had a roaring fire going, then turned his attention to his dying patient. Working with practiced efficiency born of frontier necessity, Daniel began cutting away her wet clothing, replacing it with warm blankets while maintaining her modesty. The head wound needed stitches, and her arm was clearly broken. A clean break, thankfully, that would heal properly with care. As he worked, Daniel studied her face. Young, maybe 20, with delicate features that spoke of refinement rather than hard prairie life. Her hands were soft, uncalloused. This wasn't a woman accustomed to manual labor. Whatever had brought her to his creek, she wasn't from around these parts. "Who are you?" he murmured, securing a splint around her broken arm. "And what were you doing out in weather like that?" The woman stirred slightly, her lips moving again. "Sorry," she breathed, so faintly he almost missed it. "Didn't mean to be trouble." Even unconscious and fighting for her life, she was apologizing for the inconvenience of being saved. Whatever her story, she clearly wasn't used to asking for help. "No trouble at all," Daniel said quietly, though he doubted she could hear him. "Sleep now. You're safe. I'll make sure you see morning, and plenty more after that." Outside, storm clouds cleared to reveal stars glittering against the mountain night. Inside the cabin, a woman who'd given up hope began the slow journey back to life, watched over by a man who decided her survival was worth whatever it cost him. Dawn crept through the cabin windows like a thief, painting everything in shades of gray and gold. Daniel had dozed fitfully in his chair by the fire, jerking awake every time the woman's breathing changed or she shifted beneath the heavy blankets. Now in the pale morning light, he could see that his patient had made it through the night. Barely. Her fever had broken some time before sunrise, leaving her pale but breathing more steadily. The gash on her forehead had stopped bleeding, though it would leave a scar, and the splint on her arm seemed to be holding properly. But she was still unconscious, lost somewhere between sleeping and waking in that dangerous place where the body fought to heal itself. Daniel rose stiffly from his chair, his back protesting after a night of sleeping upright. He needed coffee, food, and to check on his livestock, but he was reluctant to leave the woman alone. What if she woke up frightened and disoriented? What if her condition worsened while he was outside? As if sensing his thoughts, her eyelids fluttered. Daniel moved quickly to kneel beside the bearskin rug, watching as her eyes slowly opened. They were brown, he noticed. A warm chocolate brown that seemed too large for her pale face. "Easy," Daniel said softly as she tried to sit up. "You've been hurt. You need to stay still." The woman's gaze darted around the cabin, taking in the rough log walls, the stone fireplace, the simple furniture. When her eyes returned to Daniel, they were filled with confusion and something that might have been fear. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the ordeal she'd been through. "My cabin, about 10 miles east of Copper Ridge. I'm Daniel McKay." He reached for a cup of water he'd kept beside the fire. "Think you can drink a little of this?" She nodded, and Daniel carefully supported her head while she sipped. The water seemed to help clear some of the fog from her eyes. "The storm," she said suddenly, memory flooding back. "I was in the creek. I thought I was going to die." "You nearly did," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "Hypothermia, blood loss, broken arm. You kept saying you wouldn't make it through the night." A flush crept up her neck at his words. "I remember you disagreeing with me." "Still do," Daniel replied with a slight smile. "You're tougher than you think." The woman tried to push herself up again, then gasped as pain shot through her injured arm. Daniel gently pressed her back down against the pillows he'd arranged for her. "That arm's going to be tender for weeks. Best keep it still." He studied her face, noting the delicate bone structure, the soft hands that had never known hard labor. "What's your name?" She hesitated, and Daniel saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not confusion this time, but calculation. She was deciding how much truth to tell him. "Sarah?" she said finally. "Sarah Collins." The pause before the surname told Daniel she was lying, but he didn't push. Everyone had reasons for keeping secrets out here, and she'd tell him the truth when she was ready. "Well, Sarah Collins, what were you doing out in that storm? That creek's a good 5 miles from the nearest road, and you're not exactly dressed for hiking through rough country." Sarah's eyes dropped to the blankets covering her. She was wearing one of Daniel's shirts now. He'd dressed her in it after cutting away her ruined dress. The memory seemed to embarrass her. "I was traveling to Denver," she said quietly. "My stagecoach broke an axle about 15 miles from here. The driver said he'd ride to town for help, told the passengers to wait with the coach. But then the storm came, and I got scared." "So you decided to walk to town in a thunderstorm?" Daniel's tone was skeptical. Sarah's cheeks reddened. "It sounds foolish now, but I thought I saw lights through the trees, thought maybe there was a farmhouse nearby. I followed what I thought was a path, but it was just a game trail. By the time I realized I was lost, the storm was getting worse." It was a plausible story, Daniel supposed, though something about it didn't ring entirely true. But he'd met plenty of city folks over the years who made poor decisions when faced with frontier conditions. "What about the other passengers?" "The driver?" "There were only 2 others, an elderly couple from Kansas City. The driver, Mr. Henderson, he seemed to know what he was doing. I'm sure they waited for rescue." Sarah's voice carried a note of guilt. "I should have stayed with them." "Probably," Daniel agreed, "but beating yourself up about it won't change anything now. You're alive, and that's what matters." He stood up and moved to the stove, where he had coffee brewing and bacon starting to sizzle in a cast-iron pan. "When's the last time you ate?" Sarah had to think about that. "Yesterday morning, I think, before we left the way station." Daniel nodded and cracked eggs into the pan beside the bacon. "No wonder you're so light. Can't survive on air and good intentions out here." As he cooked, Daniel found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. She was pretty, certainly, with those expressive brown eyes and dark hair that probably looked lovely when it wasn't matted with creek water. But there was something else about her, an alertness, an intelligence that suggested she was more than just another pampered city woman who'd gotten in over her head. "Mr. McKay," Sarah said suddenly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Daniel looked up from the eggs. "All right. How bad are my injuries, really? Will I recover completely?" The question was asked with the kind of calm courage that impressed Daniel. She wasn't looking for false reassurance or pretty lies. She wanted the truth, however difficult it might be. The head wound will heal, though you'll have a scar, Daniel said honestly. The arm's a clean break. Should mend properly if you keep it immobilized for a few weeks. You were pretty severely chilled, but your body temperature's back to normal now. Sarah nodded, absorbing this information. How long before I can travel? Couple of weeks minimum. Maybe longer, depending on how you heal. Daniel saw something flash across her face at his words. Not disappointment, but what looked almost like relief, as if the prospect of being stuck here didn't bother her as much as it should have. I have money, Sarah said quickly. Not much, but I can pay for your trouble, for the food and medical care. We'll worry about that later, Daniel replied, bringing her a plate of eggs and bacon. Right now, your job is to eat and get your strength back. Sarah accepted the food gratefully, eating with the careful precision of someone who'd been taught proper manners, but was too hungry to worry about appearances. Daniel found himself watching her again, noting the way she held her fork, the unconscious grace in her movements, despite her injuries. Mr. McKay, she said between bites, may I ask you something personal? Shoot! Do you live here alone? I mean, is there a Mrs. McKay I should be concerned about? A woman might not appreciate her husband bringing home a strange female in the middle of the night. Daniel's expression grew somber. My wife died 3 years ago. Fever. It's just been me since then. I'm sorry, Sarah said, and her sympathy seemed genuine. That must be very lonely. It has its moments, Daniel admitted, but I keep busy enough. Ranch doesn't run itself. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle. Daniel found himself enjoying the company more than he'd expected. It had been a long time since he'd had someone to talk to, besides his horses and his handful of hired hands. Mr. McKay, Sarah said as she finished her breakfast, I want you to know how grateful I am. You saved my life last night, and you're continuing to save it today by letting me stay here. I won't forget your kindness. Daniel met her eyes, seeing something in them that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Just doing what anyone decent would do. No, Sarah said firmly. Not everyone would have risked their life to pull a stranger out of a flooding creek. Not everyone would take that stranger into their home and care for them without asking questions. You're a good man, Daniel McKay, and I hope someday I can repay you properly. Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks at her praise. He wasn't used to such direct gratitude, especially from someone as refined and well-spoken as Sarah seemed to be. You just focus on getting better, he said gruffly. Everything else can wait. As Daniel cleared away the breakfast dishes, he found himself wondering about the woman resting by his fireplace. Sarah Collins, if that was even her real name, was clearly more than she appeared to be. The way she spoke, her manners, her education, all suggested breeding and money. So what was a woman like that doing traveling alone to Denver? And why did she seem almost relieved to be stranded here, miles from anywhere? He had a feeling that learning the truth about Sarah Collins was going to be far more complicated than treating her physical injuries. But as he looked at her resting peacefully beside his fire, Daniel found he didn't mind the complication nearly as much as he probably should have. Some mysteries, he was beginning to think, were worth solving. 3 days had passed since Daniel pulled Sarah from the creek, and she was proving to be a far more interesting patient than he'd expected. Despite her injuries, she insisted on making herself useful around the cabin, folding laundry with her good arm, helping prepare simple meals, even attempting to mend a tear in one of his shirts with awkward one-handed stitches. You don't need to do that, Daniel said, finding her struggling with his needle and thread at the kitchen table. You're supposed to be resting. Sarah looked up from her handiwork, frustration evident in her brown eyes. I can't just lie around being useless, Mr. McKay. You've done so much for me already. The least I can do is try to help. The least you can do is heal properly, Daniel countered, but there was gentleness in his voice. He'd grown accustomed to her presence over the past few days, finding himself looking forward to their conversations over meals and by the evening fire. Sarah set down the shirt with a sigh. I'm not very good at being idle. Back home, I always kept busy with various activities. What kind of activities? Daniel asked, settling into the chair across from her with his morning coffee. Again, that hesitation he'd noticed before. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the table, as she seemed to choose her words carefully. Charity work, mostly. Helping at the church, visiting the sick, that sort of thing. It was a safe answer, the kind of response any respectable woman might give. But Daniel was beginning to recognize the tells that indicated Sarah was being less than completely honest. The way her eyes wouldn't quite meet his, the slight stiffness in her voice, the generic nature of her responses. Must have been a big church, Daniel observed, to keep someone as energetic as you fully occupied. Sarah's cheeks flushed. It was a good congregation. Very active in the community. Daniel decided to try a different approach. What did your family think about you traveling to Denver alone? Can't imagine most fathers would approve of their daughters making such a journey without escort. This time Sarah's reaction was more pronounced. Her face went pale and her good hand clenched into a fist on the table. My father is... He wasn't consulted about my travel plans. Dead? Daniel asked gently. No, Sarah said quietly. Very much alive. We don't see eye to eye on certain matters. Daniel sensed he was getting closer to something important. Family disagreements can be difficult. What kind of matters? Sarah stood abruptly, moving to the window with careful steps. Her injured arm was still in its splint, but she was moving more freely now, though Daniel noticed she still favored her left side where she'd taken the worst of the battering in the creek. Mr. McKay, she said without turning around, you've been more than kind to me, but I think it's better if we don't discuss my family situation. Some things are better left in the past. Daniel studied her silhouette against the window, noting the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself. Whatever had driven Sarah Collins, if that was even her real name, away from her family was clearly painful and probably complicated. Fair enough, Daniel said, but you should know that if you're running from something, this ranch is about as far from civilization as you can get without falling off the map entirely. Whatever you're trying to escape, it's not likely to find you here. Sarah turned to look at him, and Daniel saw gratitude in something else. Relief, perhaps, or hope, flicker across her features. Is that why you stay here? She asked. To escape something? Daniel considered the question seriously. Maybe at first. After Catherine died, I didn't much want to be around other people. Seemed easier to hole up here and pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. But you don't feel that way anymore? Not as much, Daniel admitted. Having you here has reminded me that isolation isn't the same as peace. Sometimes company makes the solitude more meaningful, if that makes sense. Sarah moved back to the table, settling carefully into her chair. It makes perfect sense. I've been alone for months now, and I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to talk to. Someone who doesn't judge or demand explanations for every decision. Daniel caught the implication in her words. Someone was judging you? Demanding explanations? Sarah's expression grew guarded again. I've said too much already. Or maybe not enough, Daniel suggested. Sarah, I can see you're running from something or someone. If there's danger involved, I need to know about it. This ranch might be isolated, but it's not invisible. If someone comes looking for you... No one will come looking, Sarah said quickly, then seemed to realize she'd revealed more than she intended. That is, I don't think anyone will. I was very careful to cover my tracks. Daniel leaned forward, his gray eyes serious. What kind of tracks does a woman involved in charity work need to cover? Sarah stared at him for a long moment, clearly wrestling with herself about how much truth to reveal. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. My name isn't Sarah Collins, she said quietly. It's Catherine Whitmore. And I wasn't doing charity work back east. I was supposed to be married. Daniel felt something twist in his chest at her words. Not jealousy exactly, but a strange sense of loss at the idea that this woman who'd begun to feel like she belonged in his cabin might be promised to another man. Supposed to be? He asked carefully. Catherine, not Sarah, twisted her hands in her lap. My father arranged the marriage. A business arrangement, really. Mr. Pemberton needed a wife to enhance his social standing, and father needed Mr. Pemberton's financial backing for his shipping business. And you objected to the arrangement? I objected to Mr. Pemberton, Catherine said firmly. He's twice my age, has buried 2 wives already, and has a reputation for treating women poorly. When I refused the marriage, Father made it clear that I had no choice in the matter. Daniel's jaw tightened. He'd known men who treated their daughters like livestock to be bartered, and the practice disgusted him. So you ran. 3 days before the wedding. I took what money I could, bought passage on the first stage heading west, and didn't look back. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if admitting the truth was liberating. I have no intention of being sold to the highest bidder like a prize heifer. Daniel found himself admiring her courage, even as he understood the gravity of her situation. And Denver? You have friends there? Family who might take you in? Catherine shook her head. I have the name of a woman who runs a boarding house for respectable ladies. I thought I could find work as a governess or teacher, make my own way in the world. That's a hard life for a woman alone, Daniel observed, especially one who's used to finer things. Harder than being married to a man who sees me as property? Catherine's eyes flashed with spirit. I'd rather scrub floors for strangers than share a bed with Harold Pemberton. Daniel couldn't argue with that logic. Does your father know where you've gone? I don't think so. I told the stage driver I was visiting relatives in California, and I paid cash for my tickets so there would be no paper trail. As far as anyone knows, Sarah Collins disappeared somewhere between Kansas and the Colorado Territory. And you think your father will just accept that? Give up looking for you? Catherine's expression grew troubled. I hope so, but Father is persistent when it comes to business arrangements, and this marriage represents a lot of money for him. Daniel stood up and moved to the window, looking out at his land with new understanding. Catherine Whitmore wasn't just a mysterious traveler who'd stumbled into his life. She was a woman who'd risked everything to escape a fate worse than death, at least in her mind. You can stay here as long as you need to, he said finally, turning back to face her, until you're fully healed, until you decide what you want to do next. This ranch is big enough for 2 people, and I could use the help with the books and correspondence. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. Mr. McKay, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Daniel's voice was firm. And my name's Daniel. I think we're past the point of formal addresses. Daniel, Catherine repeated as if testing how his name felt on her tongue. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, Daniel replied with a slight smile. You haven't seen how bad my bookkeeping is. You might change your mind about staying once you get a look at my ledgers. Catherine laughed, the first genuine laugh Daniel had heard from her since pulling her from the creek. The sound transformed her face, making her look younger and more carefree than he'd yet seen her. I think I can handle whatever chaos you've created with your accounts, she said. After all, I've already survived a flood, hypothermia, and 3 days of your cooking. How much worse could your bookkeeping be? Daniel feigned offense. My cooking's not that bad. It's edible, Catherine said diplomatically, then grinned. Barely. As they laughed together in the warm kitchen, with morning sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee lingering in the air, Daniel realized something had shifted between them. Catherine Whitmore was no longer just an injured stranger he was helping. She was becoming someone he cared about, someone he looked forward to seeing across his breakfast table each morning. The thought should have worried him more than it did. Daniel McKay had convinced himself he was done with complications, especially the kind that came with caring about someone. But as he watched Catherine attempt to pour herself more coffee with her good hand, laughing when she nearly spilled it across the table, Daniel found he didn't mind this particular complication nearly as much as he should have. Outside, his cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun, and the work of the ranch waited as it always did. But inside his cabin, something new was taking root. The possibility that the isolated life he'd built for himself might be improved by sharing it with the right person. And Catherine Whitmore, despite the secrets and potential dangers she'd brought with her, was beginning to feel very much like the right person indeed. 2 weeks had passed since Catherine revealed her true identity, and she'd settled into ranch life with surprising ease. Her broken arm was healing well, though she still wore the splint Daniel had fashioned for her. More importantly, she'd proven invaluable with the ranch's business affairs, organizing Daniel's chaotic records into neat ledgers that actually made sense. "You've been undercharging for your beef by at least 15%, Catherine announced over breakfast, looking up from the account book she'd spread across the kitchen table. "And you haven't raised your prices in 3 years, despite the cost of feed and supplies going up considerably." Daniel paused in his coffee drinking, impressed by her business acumen. "How can you tell all that from those messy ledgers?" Catherine smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that Daniel found himself noticing more and more often. "Mathematics, mostly. And common sense. You're too generous for your own good, Daniel McKay." "Maybe," Daniel admitted, "but most of my customers are struggling too. Seemed wrong to squeeze them harder just to line my own pockets." "There's a difference between being fair and being foolish," Catherine replied gently. "You can't help anyone if you run yourself into bankruptcy through misplaced kindness." Daniel found himself studying Catherine's face as she spoke. Over the past weeks, she'd gained weight and color, the hollow-cheeked look of desperation replaced by the healthy glow of a woman who felt safe and valued. Her dark hair, which had been matted and tangled when he pulled her from the creek, now shone with health and was usually pinned up in a practical style that suited her new role as ranch manager. "You're staring," Catherine observed without looking up from her calculations. "Sorry," Daniel said, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "It's just, you look different. Better. Better than half-drowned and delirious with fever?" "I should hope so." "You know what I mean," Daniel said quietly. "You look happy." Catherine set down her pencil and met his gaze. "I am happy. For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I want to be, doing work that matters." I'd forgotten what that felt like. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Daniel found himself leaning forward, drawn by something in Catherine's expression that made his heart race. But before either of them could speak, the sound of approaching horses shattered the intimate atmosphere. Daniel was on his feet instantly, his hand moving automatically to the rifle he kept beside the door. Visitors were rare this far from town, and unexpected ones usually meant trouble. "Stay here," he told Catherine. But she was already moving to the window, her face pale with sudden fear. "Daniel," she whispered urgently, "there are 6 men out there, well-dressed, riding expensive horses. They're not local ranchers." Daniel's jaw tightened as he recognized the implication. "Your father's men?" Catherine nodded, her hand pressed to her throat. "I think so. The man in front looks like Mr. Jameson, father's business partner. If he's here, then your father knows exactly where you are," Daniel finished grimly. "Any idea how they found you?" "The stage driver," Catherine said with dawning horror. "When the coach broke down, he must have remembered me after all. Father probably offered a reward for information." Daniel checked his rifle's load, his movements calm and efficient despite the tension crackling through the cabin. "What do they want? To drag you back home?" "To drag me back to Harold Pemberton and that wedding I ran from," Catherine replied, still entering her voice. "But I won't go. I'd rather die than marry that man." "It won't come to that," Daniel said firmly. "This is my land, and you're under my protection. They can't force you to do anything." A sharp knock echoed through the cabin, followed by a cultured voice Daniel didn't recognize. "Miss Whitmore, we know you're in there. Come out, and let's discuss this like civilized people." Catherine moved to stand beside Daniel, her good hand resting on his arm. "That's definitely Jameson. He's father's enforcer when it comes to business deals that aren't going according to plan." Daniel opened the door but didn't step outside, keeping his rifle visible as he faced the 6 mounted men. The leader was indeed well-dressed, with the soft look of a man who'd never done physical labor. But his eyes were hard, calculating, and the men behind him had the look of hired muscle. "Gentlemen," Daniel said coolly, "you're on private property. State your business." Jameson's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Mr. McKay, I presume." "I'm James Jameson, representing the interests of Mr. Horace Whitmore of Philadelphia. We've come to escort his daughter home. Miss Whitmore is recovering from serious injuries," Daniel replied. "She's not fit to travel." "I'm sure you've taken excellent care of her," Jameson said with oily condescension. "But Mr. Whitmore is naturally concerned about his daughter's welfare. particularly given her impulsive decision to abandon her responsibilities back home. Catherine stepped into view behind Daniel, her chin raised defiantly. My responsibilities, Mr. Jameson? Or father's business arrangement with Harold Pemberton? Jameson's expression hardened. Miss Whitmore, you've caused your family considerable distress with your thoughtless behavior. Your father has been beside himself with worry, and poor Mr. Pemberton has been devastated by your abandonment. Poor Mr. Pemberton can find another wife to brutalize, Catherine shot back. I hear widows are particularly vulnerable to his charms. That's quite enough, Jameson snapped, his veneer of civility cracking. You're coming with us, Catherine. Your father has invested too much in this arrangement to let you ruin it with schoolgirl theatrics. The lady said no, Daniel interjected, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man prepared to back up his words with action. That's the end of the discussion. Jameson's eyes narrowed as he took in Daniel's stance, the rifle in his hands, the unmistakable air of a man who knew how to use violence when necessary. Mr. McKay, I'm sure you mean well, but this is a family matter. Miss Whitmore is needed at home. Miss Whitmore is needed right here, Daniel replied steadily, and she's staying until she decides otherwise. I'm afraid that's not acceptable, Jameson said, gesturing slightly to his men. Mr. Whitmore has been quite clear about his expectations. Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle. And I'm being quite clear about mine. Catherine stays, you leave. End of negotiation. The tension ratcheted higher as Jameson's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. But before anyone could draw, Catherine stepped forward. Wait, she said, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising authority. Mr. Jameson, I have a proposition for you. Daniel shot her a sharp look, but Catherine kept her gaze fixed on Jameson. I'm listening, the businessman said warily. Tell my father I'll return to Philadelphia and honor the engagement to Mr. Pemberton, Catherine said, ignoring Daniel's sharp intake of breath. On one condition. Catherine, Daniel said urgently, but she held up her hand to silence him. The condition, Catherine continued, is that Mr. Pemberton comes here to collect me personally. If he wants a wife badly enough to wait 2 months for father to track me down, then he can demonstrate his commitment by making the journey west himself. Jameson frowned. I don't see what purpose that would serve. It would serve the purpose of proving his sincerity, Catherine replied smoothly. Any man can pay others to retrieve his runaway bride. A man truly committed to marriage would come himself, wouldn't he? Daniel began to understand what Catherine was doing, and despite his concern for her safety, he felt a surge of admiration for her cleverness. She was buying time, putting obstacles in her father's path, creating opportunities for other solutions to present themselves. Mr. Pemberton is a busy man, Jameson protested. He has business interests that require his attention. Then perhaps he's too busy for a wife, Catherine suggested sweetly. I'm sure father can find him someone more convenient. Someone who won't require personal attention or consideration. Jameson's face reddened with frustrated anger. Miss Whitmore, you're being deliberately difficult. I'm being practical, Catherine corrected. If Mr. Pemberton wants to marry me, he can court me properly. That includes the inconvenience of traveling to meet his intended bride. And if he refuses, Catherine's smile was razor sharp, then father will have to decide whether this business arrangement is worth more than his daughter's happiness. I suspect even he has limits to how far he'll go for money. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Jameson clearly weighing his options. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. Very well, he said curtly. I'll relay your terms to your father. But understand this, Miss Whitmore. You're only delaying the inevitable. One way or another, you'll fulfill your obligations. We'll see about that, Catherine replied calmly. After the men rode away, Daniel turned to Catherine with a mixture of admiration and concern. That was either very clever or very dangerous. Both, Catherine admitted, her composure finally cracking as the reality of her situation hit her. But it buys us time. 2 months, maybe 3, before Pemberton could make the journey if he chooses to come. And if he does come, Catherine's expression grew determined. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Daniel, you need to know that I meant what I said. I'd rather die than marry Harold Pemberton. If it comes to that. Daniel caught her hands in his, stopping her words. It won't come to that. I promise you, Catherine. Whatever it takes, whatever we have to do, you're not going back to a life you don't want. Catherine looked into his gray eyes and saw absolute sincerity there, along with something deeper that made her heart skip. Daniel, you don't understand what you're promising. My father has money, influence, connections. If he decides to make trouble for you, let him try, Daniel said simply. I've faced down worse than angry businessmen and their hired guns. And Catherine? He paused, his voice growing softer. I've got reasons to fight that your father couldn't understand or buy. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the implication in his words. What kind of reasons? Daniel's answer was interrupted by the sound of a rider approaching fast. They tensed, thinking Jameson had returned, but it was one of Daniel's hired hands, a young man named Pete who helped with the cattle. Boss, Pete called as he reined in his lathered horse. You need to know. There's been men asking questions in town about a young lady matching Miss Catherine's description, offering money for information about where she might be staying. Daniel cursed under his breath. How much money? Enough to tempt some folks who might not usually be tempted, Pete replied grimly. And boss? They weren't the only ones asking questions. There's been a gentleman from back east, well-dressed fellow with pale eyes, been staying at the hotel for 3 days. Folks say he's been real interested in maps of the area, asking about ranches and such. Catherine went white. Harold Pemberton, he's already here. Daniel's expression hardened into something dangerous. Then it looks like we're past the point of negotiations and bargaining for time. Pete, I want you to ride to the Miller Ranch and ask Tom if he can spare a few men. Tell him it's important. What are you planning? Catherine asked, though something in Daniel's tone told her she might not like the answer. Daniel looked at her with eyes that had gone cold as winter steel. I'm planning to make it very clear to Mr. Harold Pemberton and anyone else who's interested that you're not available for purchase, negotiation, or forced marriage. And if that message doesn't get through with words, then I'll deliver it in a language they're more likely to understand. As Pete rode away to gather reinforcements and the sun began to set over the Colorado Territory, Catherine realized that the peaceful interlude she'd found at Daniel's ranch was about to come to a violent end. But as she looked at this good man who was willing to risk everything to protect her freedom, she also realized that she'd found something worth fighting for. Whether they survived what was coming remained to be seen, but Catherine Whitmore was no longer the frightened girl who'd fled Philadelphia in the middle of the night. She was a woman who'd found her strength, her purpose, and possibly her heart in the most unlikely of places. And she wasn't going to give any of those things up without a fight. The confrontation came at dawn, just as Daniel had expected. Harold Pemberton arrived with a dozen men, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth of the ranch yard like a death march. Daniel watched from his front porch, rifle in hand, flanked by Tom Miller and 4 other ranchers who'd answered his call for help. Catherine stood behind him in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. She'd insisted on facing whatever was coming, refusing Daniel's suggestion that she hide in the cabin until it was over. Pemberton himself was exactly what Daniel had imagined. A soft, well-fed man in his 50s with cold, pale eyes and the kind of smile that never reached beyond his mouth. He rode an expensive horse and wore clothes that cost more than most men made in a year. But there was something fundamentally weak about him, something that spoke of a man who'd never faced real opposition in his life. Miss Whitmore, Pemberton called out as he reined in his mount 20 feet from the porch, you've led us quite a chase. I hope you're satisfied with the trouble you've caused. Catherine stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. Mr. Pemberton, I'm surprised to see you. I wouldn't have thought you'd bother with the inconvenience of traveling so far. Pemberton's smile turned ugly. When something belongs to me, Miss Whitmore, I make it a point to retrieve it personally, especially when it's been misplaced. I don't belong to anyone, Catherine replied coldly, and I never will. That's where you're wrong, my dear, Pemberton said, his voice carrying the oily confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Your father and I have a binding agreement. You are, legally speaking, already mine. Daniel stepped forward, his rifle held casually but ready. The lady's made her position clear, Pemberton. She's not going anywhere with you. Pemberton's pale eyes fixed on Daniel with undisguised contempt. And you are? Daniel McKay. This is my land, and Miss Whitmore is under my protection. Your protection? Pemberton repeated mockingly. How rustic. Miss Whitmore, surely you can see how inappropriate this arrangement has become. Living unmarried with a man, compromising your reputation, acting like some common frontier strumpet. Daniel's finger tightened on his rifle's trigger, but Catherine's voice cut through his anger like a blade. My reputation, Mr. Pemberton? You're concerned about my reputation? Catherine's laugh was sharp and bitter. The same reputation that would be enhanced by marrying a man who buried 2 previous wives under suspicious circumstances. Pemberton's face darkened with rage. How dare you imply— I'm not implying anything, Catherine interrupted. I'm stating facts. Your first wife died of a mysterious fever after only 6 months of marriage. Your second wife suffered a fatal fall down the stairs just 2 years later. Both deaths occurred shortly after they'd begun showing signs of independence or rebellion against your particular requirements for a wife. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Daniel saw several of Pemberton's men exchange uncertain glances. Clearly, they'd heard the rumors too. Those are vicious lies spread by jealous rivals, Pemberton snarled. I love both my wives dearly. The way you love them to death? Catherine asked sweetly. Forgive me if I decline to join their ranks. Pemberton's composure finally cracked completely. Enough! You'll come with me now, Catherine, willingly or otherwise. I've invested too much time and money in this arrangement to let it be ruined by your hysterics. The lady said no, Daniel repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. That's the end of it. Pemberton gestured to his men, several of whom began to dismount. Mr. McKay, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Don't be foolish. Maybe, Daniel allowed, but you're forgetting something important. What's that? Daniel's smile was cold as winter. This is Colorado territory. Out here, we settle disputes with lead and gunpowder, not lawyers and contracts. And I guarantee you, Pemberton, that before you lay a hand on Catherine, you'll have to go through me and every man standing beside me. The ranchers flanking Daniel raised their own weapons, making their allegiances crystal clear. Tom Miller stepped forward, his weathered face set in determined lines. That's right, Tom said firmly. We protect our own out here, and Miss Catherine's become one of our own. You want her, you'll have to kill all of us first. Pemberton's men were clearly having second thoughts about the wisdom of their employer's mission. They'd signed on to intimidate a lone rancher, not face down a small army of armed frontiersmen who looked like they knew how to use their weapons. This is preposterous, Pemberton blustered, but Daniel could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Catherine, be reasonable. Think of your father, your family's reputation. Think of the financial ruin you'll bring upon them if you don't honor this agreement. I am thinking of them, Catherine replied. I'm thinking that some things are more important than money, like dignity, like freedom, like the right to choose who I spend my life with. She moved to stand beside Daniel, her good hand resting on his arm in a gesture that spoke volumes about where her loyalties lay. And I choose to stay here with Daniel, building a life based on mutual respect and affection rather than financial transactions. Pemberton's face went white with rage. You choose this peasant over everything I can offer you? Comfort, luxury, position in society? I choose the man who pulled me from a flooding creek and nursed me back to health without asking for anything in return, Catherine said firmly. I choose the man who sees me as a partner, not property. I choose love over convenience, honor over wealth. Daniel felt his heart skip at her words, but there was no time to process the implications. Pemberton was reaching for something inside his coat, and Daniel's instincts screamed danger. Look out! He shouted, pushing Catherine behind him just as Pemberton drew a small pistol from his jacket. The shot rang out across the ranch yard, but Pemberton's aim was poor and the bullet went wide. Daniel's return shot was not. The rifle bullet took Pemberton in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle to land hard in the dust. Several of Pemberton's men reached for their weapons, but found themselves staring down the barrels of 5 rifles held by men who knew how to use them. The uneven odds suddenly seemed much more uneven in the other direction. "Anyone else want to try their luck?" Tom Miller asked conversationally. "Because we've got plenty of bullets to go around." Pemberton writhed in the dirt, clutching his wounded shoulder and screaming threats and curses. But his men were already backing away, clearly unwilling to die for their employer's wounded pride. "Get him patched up and get him out of here," Daniel ordered, his rifle still trained on the groaning businessman. "And if any of you ever set foot on my land again, I'll assume you're here to cause trouble and respond accordingly." As Pemberton's men helped their wounded boss into a wagon for the journey back to town, Catherine moved to Daniel's side. Her face was pale but resolute, and when she looked at him, Daniel saw something in her brown eyes that made his chest tighten with hope. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded, lowering his rifle. "It's over. Pemberton won't be back. Men like him don't have the stomach for real fights. And once word spreads about what happened here, your father will understand that you're serious about staying." Catherine was quiet for a moment, absorbing the reality of her freedom. Then she turned to face Daniel fully, her expression earnest and vulnerable. "Daniel, what I said out there, about choosing you, about love, I meant every word." Daniel felt his heart hammer against his ribs. "Catherine, I know this isn't how these things usually happen," she continued quickly, as if afraid she'd lose her nerve. "I know I'm supposed to wait for you to speak first, to be more subtle and indirect. But I've spent too much of my life letting other people make my choices for me. I want to choose you, Daniel McKay, not as a refuge or a convenience, but because I love you." Daniel stared at her for a long moment. This remarkable woman who'd survived a flood, faced down hired guns, and just declared her love with the straightforward courage of a true frontierswoman. "Catherine Whitmore," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "you just saved me the trouble of figuring out how to ask you the same question." He reached for her, and she came into his arms like she belonged there. When he kissed her, with the Colorado sun warming their faces and his friends cheering in the background, Daniel tasted not just love, but freedom. The freedom to choose their own path, to build their own life, to write their own story. When they finally broke apart, Catherine was smiling through tears of joy and relief. "So what happens now?" Daniel's answering smile was radiant. "Now we get married, run this ranch together, and prove that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places." As Tom Miller and the other ranchers offered congratulations and headed back to their own spreads, Daniel and Catherine stood together on the porch of what would soon be their home, watching the dust settle from the confrontation that had changed everything. The woman who'd whispered, "I won't make it through the night," had not only survived, she'd found a life worth living and a man worth sharing it with. And the rancher who'd refused to accept her surrender had gained far more than he'd ever expected when he pulled a dying stranger from a flooded creek. Some rescues, Daniel realized, saved more than one person. This one had saved them both. 3 weeks after Harold Pemberton limped back to Philadelphia with his tail between his legs, the McKay Ranch had settled into a rhythm of contentment that felt as natural as breathing. Catherine's arm had healed completely, and she moved through the daily routines of ranch life with the confidence of someone who'd found her true calling. Daniel stood in the barn doorway, watching her work with the horses, marveling at how different she looked from the half-drowned woman he'd pulled from the creek 2 months ago. Catherine had traded her torn city dress for practical frontier clothing. Sturdy boots, split riding skirts, and work shirts that could withstand the demands of ranch life. But more than her appearance had changed. There was a strength in her bearing now, a certainty that spoke of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. "You're staring again," Catherine called out without turning around, amusement evident in her voice as she brushed down Daniel's favorite mare. "Getting to be a habit," Daniel admitted, stepping into the barn. "Can't seem to help myself." Catherine turned to face him, hay in her dark hair and a smudge of dirt on her cheek that somehow made her more beautiful than any expensive gown ever had. "Well, you'd better learn to control yourself once we're married." "People will talk." The casual reference to their upcoming wedding sent a familiar warmth through Daniel's chest. They decided to marry as soon as the circuit preacher made his monthly rounds through Copper Ridge, which meant they had another week to wait. It felt like an eternity. Speaking of which, Daniel said, moving closer, Tom Miller rode over this morning with news from town. Seems your father's been asking questions through his lawyers. Catherine's expression grew wary. What kind of questions? Legal ones, mostly. Whether a marriage performed in Colorado territory would be binding if you returned to Pennsylvania. Whether a woman can renounce a previous engagement without her father's consent. Catherine set down the brush and turned to face Daniel fully. And what did the lawyers tell him? Daniel's smile was reassuring. That once you're married to me, Harold Pemberton has no legal claim to you whatsoever, and that your father's business agreement with him isn't worth the paper it's written on if the bride refuses to participate. So it's really over, Catherine said, the words carrying the weight of someone who'd hardly dared to hope. It's really over, Daniel confirmed. You're free, Catherine. Completely free to choose your own future. Catherine moved into his arms and Daniel held her close, breathing in the scent of sunshine and honest work that clung to her hair. I choose you, she said against his chest. I choose this life, this place, this future we're building together. Daniel pulled back to look at her face, seeing not just love there, but the kind of deep contentment that came from being exactly where you belonged. Any regrets about giving up the luxury and comfort of Philadelphia society? Catherine laughed, the sound bright and free. Regrets? Daniel, I've never been happier in my life. I wake up every morning knowing that the work I do matters, that I'm valued for my mind and my efforts rather than my dowry or my bloodline. I wouldn't trade this life for all the drawing rooms and tea parties in Philadelphia. Even when winter comes and we're snowed in for weeks at a time, even when the work is hard and the profits are thin, especially then, Catherine replied firmly, because whatever hardships we face, we'll face them together. As partners, not as owner and property, Daniel kissed her then, tasting the promise of their future on her lips. When they broke apart, both were breathing harder, and Daniel felt the familiar pull of desire that had been growing stronger with each passing day. One more week, Catherine whispered, echoing his thoughts. One more week, Daniel agreed, though his voice suggested he wasn't entirely sure how he'd survive the wait. They were interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. Daniel recognized the voice calling out a greeting. It was Mrs. Patterson from town, the wife of the general store owner. Miss Catherine, Mrs. Patterson called as she climbed down from her wagon, her arms full of packages. I brought those supplies you ordered and something extra. Catherine hurried forward to help with the packages, curious about what Mrs. Patterson might have brought. The older woman's eyes were sparkling with excitement, the look of someone bursting to share good news. What is it, Mrs. Patterson? Catherine asked, accepting the packages. Wedding dress fabric, Mrs. Patterson announced triumphantly. The finest silk we've had in the store in years. Just arrived on yesterday's supply wagon. Perfect for a bride who deserves something special. Catherine's eyes widened as Mrs. Patterson unwrapped yards of cream-colored silk that shimmered like moonlight. Mrs. Patterson, it's beautiful, but I can't possibly afford. Already paid for, Mrs. Patterson interrupted with a wave of her hand. Anonymous donation from someone who thinks very highly of you and Mr. McKay. Daniel and Catherine exchanged glances, both suspecting they knew who the anonymous donor was. Tom Miller had a soft heart beneath his gruff exterior, and he'd grown quite fond of Catherine over the past weeks. There's more, Mrs. Patterson continued, pulling out lace trim, pearl buttons, and thread in exactly the right colors. Enough to make a dress fit for a queen, if I do say so myself. And I happen to know that Sarah Henderson is the finest seamstress in 3 counties. She's already agreed to help with the sewing. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the kindness of these people who'd welcomed her into their community without question or judgment. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let us help, Mrs. Patterson replied warmly. Say you'll let the women of Copper Ridge make sure you have the wedding you deserve. Daniel watched this exchange with growing emotion. Catherine had found more than safety and love at his ranch. She'd found a family, a community that had embraced her as one of their own. The lonely, frightened woman who'd fled Philadelphia had become someone beloved and valued by people who measured worth by character rather than bank accounts. I would be honored, Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. Truly honored. Mrs. Patterson beamed and began gathering the fabric. Wonderful. Sarah's expecting us this afternoon if you can spare the time. We'll have you fitted and started on the most beautiful wedding dress Colorado Territory has ever seen. After Mrs. Patterson left with Catherine in tow for the dress fitting, Daniel found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time in weeks. He wandered through the cabin that would soon be their home, seeing it with new eyes. The place needed work, he realized. A woman's touch, improvements that would make it truly suitable for the life they planned to build together. Daniel had been content with bare functionality, but Catherine deserved better. She deserved a home that reflected the love and partnership they were creating. By the time Catherine returned from town, flushed with excitement and full of stories about the kindness of the local women, Daniel had made a decision. How do you feel about making some changes to the cabin? He asked over dinner. Catherine looked up from her plate, intrigued. What kind of changes? Improvements. Additions, maybe. A bigger kitchen, a proper parlor, a front porch where we can sit in the evenings and watch the sunset? Daniel's voice grew more animated as he spoke. I've been thinking that this place should reflect who we are together, not just who I was alone. Catherine's smile was radiant. Daniel McKay, are you asking me to help you design our home? I'm asking you to help me build our future, Daniel replied. Every board, every nail, every decision. This should be our place, Catherine. Not just mine with you living in it. Catherine reached across the table to take his hand. I love that idea. I love that you see us as true partners in everything. We are true partners, Daniel said seriously. In work, in love, in building something that will last long after we're gone. I want children to grow up in this house someday, Catherine. Our children. I want them to inherit something we built together with our own hands. Catherine's breath caught at the mention of children. They'd never directly discussed having a family, but the assumption that they would, that their love would create new life, filled her with a joy so profound she could barely speak. How many children? She asked softly. Daniel grinned. As many as you're willing to give me. This land can support a big family, and I think we both got enough love stored up to share with however many little ones come along. Catherine pictured it, children playing in the yard, helping with the horses, learning the values of hard work and honest living that Daniel embodied. It was a vision of the future that was so different from what she'd been raised to expect, yet so much more appealing than anything her father had ever planned for her. I want that too, she said. All of it. The home, the family, the life we'll create together. Daniel raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then that's what we'll have, starting with a wedding that gives this community something to celebrate. That evening, as they sat together on the current front porch, planning improvements to their future home, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 2 months ago, she'd been running from a life she didn't want, desperate and frightened, and convinced she'd never find happiness. Now she was planning a future with a man who saw her as an equal partner, surrounded by a community that valued her for who she was, rather than what she represented financially. She was about to become Catherine McKay, wife of a Colorado rancher, and she couldn't imagine a better fate. Daniel? She said as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. When I was dying in that creek, when I told you I wouldn't make it through the night, did you know? Even then, did you know that you were saving more than just my life? Daniel considered her question seriously. I knew I couldn't let you give up. Something in me recognized something in you, even when you were more dead than alive. Maybe it was destiny, maybe it was just stubbornness, but I knew you belonged here. Catherine leaned against his shoulder, marveling at the simple truth of his words. She had belonged here, even before she knew this place existed. She'd belonged with Daniel McKay from the moment he'd refused to accept her surrender. One more week until they could make it official, until she could take his name and commit her life to building something beautiful in this wild, wonderful land. It felt like the beginning of everything she'd ever truly wanted. The woman who'd whispered her surrender in the darkness had become a woman eager to embrace whatever the future might bring. And that future was looking brighter than any sunrise over the Colorado mountains. 1 year later, Catherine McKay stood at the kitchen window of their newly expanded cabin, watching her husband teach their neighbor's young son how to rope cattle. The morning sun caught the gold highlights in Daniel's dark hair, and his patient voice carried across the yard as he corrected the boy's technique with gentle encouragement. The cabin had indeed been transformed over the past months. The new parlor was furnished with comfortable chairs and a bookshelf Daniel had built with his own hands. The enlarged kitchen boasted a proper stove and enough space for Catherine to prepare meals for the ranch hands during busy seasons. Most importantly, they'd added 2 bedrooms to the back of the house, one for guests and one that would soon serve a very different purpose. Catherine's hand moved unconsciously to her slightly rounded belly, where their first child grew strong and active. Dr. Patterson from town had confirmed what she'd suspected for weeks now. By spring, the McKay Ranch would have a new addition to the family. "Mama Catherine!" a voice called from the yard, and Catherine smiled at the sight of Lucy Henderson, the 7-year-old daughter of their nearest neighbors, running toward the house with something clutched in her small hands. The child had started calling her Mama Catherine shortly after the wedding, despite having a perfectly good mother of her own. Catherine suspected it was because she always had time to listen to Lucy's elaborate stories and help with any small crisis that arose during the girls' frequent visits to the ranch. "What have you got there, sweetheart?" Catherine asked, stepping onto the front porch to greet her young visitor. Lucy held up a handful of wildflowers, slightly wilted from her enthusiastic grip. "I picked these for you. Papa Henderson says wildflowers are the prettiest because they choose where to grow all by themselves." Catherine accepted the bouquet with appropriate reverence. "They're beautiful, Lucy." "Just like you," the little girl beamed, then grew more serious. "Mama Catherine, are you really going to have a baby?" "Mama Henderson says you are, but Jimmy Morrison says babies come from the store in Denver." Catherine laughed, settling into one of the rocking chairs Daniel had made for the porch. "I am indeed going to have a baby. Your Mama Henderson is quite right. Will it be a boy baby or a girl baby? We won't know until it arrives. Which would you prefer?" Lucy considered this with the gravity of someone making an important decision. "A girl baby, I think. Then I could teach her how to braid hair and catch frogs." "An excellent combination of skills," Catherine agreed solemnly. "I'll be sure to let the baby know your preferences." Daniel approached the porch, having finished his lesson with young Tom Miller. His eyes met Catherine's with the warm intimacy of a happily married couple, and Catherine felt the familiar flutter of joy that came from being looked at with such complete love and acceptance. "How are my girls today?" Daniel asked, settling into the chair beside Catherine and noting Lucy's presence with fond amusement. "I'm not your girl," Lucy protested with a giggle. "I'm the Hendersons' girl, but I'm going to help teach your baby everything important." "Like what?" Daniel asked seriously. "How to ride horses and milk cows and make wildflower crowns and catch fireflies," Lucy recited importantly, "and how to tell which berries are good for eating and which ones make you sick." "Sounds like a comprehensive education," Daniel observed. "I'm sure our baby will be grateful for such an excellent teacher." Lucy scrambled up onto Daniel's lap with the easy familiarity of a child who'd been welcomed and cherished in this home since its creation. Catherine watched this interaction with deep contentment, knowing their own children would grow up surrounded by this kind of warmth and community support. "Uncle Daniel," Lucy said seriously, "do you think your baby will like living on a ranch? Some babies might want to live in town with more people around." Daniel glanced at Catherine, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Lucy, I think babies are pretty adaptable. They tend to be happy wherever they're loved and cared for. But I suspect our baby will love ranch life, since both Mom and Papa chose it over city living." "Mama Catherine chose ranch life?" Lucy asked with surprise. "But Mama Henderson says she came from a big fancy city back east." Catherine nodded. "I did come from Philadelphia, which is indeed a big fancy city. But I discovered that big and fancy doesn't always mean better. Sometimes the best life is the one you build for yourself in exactly the place where you belong." "And you belong here?" "I belong with your Uncle Daniel," Catherine said simply. "And he belongs here. So this is where I belong too." Lucy seemed satisfied with this explanation and went back to playing with the wildflowers. Daniel reached over to take Catherine's hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Any word from Philadelphia?" Daniel asked quietly, though they both knew the answer. Catherine shook her head. "Nothing since Father's lawyer sent the final documents 6 months ago. I think he's finally accepted that I'm not coming back." "Any regrets?" Catherine considered the question as she had many times over the past year. "Only one," she said finally. Daniel's eyebrows rose in concern. "What's that?" "I regret that it took a flood and a near-death experience to bring me here. I wish I'd been brave enough to choose this life sooner." Daniel brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Maybe you weren't ready to choose it sooner. Maybe you needed to go through everything you went through to become the woman who could appreciate what we have here. You think everything happens for a reason? I think some things happen for a reason, and other things just happen. But I think we have the power to find meaning in whatever circumstances we're given." Lucy looked up from her flowers with the sharp attention of a child who'd caught interesting adult conversation. "What circumstances?" "The things that happen to us that we can't control," Catherine explained, "like storms, or getting lost, or meeting new people." "Oh, like when you got caught in the flood and Uncle Daniel saved you." "Exactly like that," Catherine agreed. "That was a circumstance neither of us planned, but it led to something wonderful. It led to you getting married and having babies and building the prettiest house in the whole territory," Lucy said with satisfaction. "I like that kind of circumstance." Daniel and Catherine exchanged amused glances over the child's head. "We like it too," Daniel said. As the afternoon wore on and Lucy eventually departed for her own home with promises to return soon, Catherine and Daniel settled into their evening routine. They sat together on their front porch, watching the sun paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and rose, discussing plans for the expanded cattle operation and preparations for the baby's arrival. "Have you thought about names?" Daniel asked, his hand resting gently on Catherine's belly. "For a boy, I'd like to name him after your father," Catherine said. "Thomas Daniel McKay has a nice sound to it." "And for a girl?" Catherine smiled. "I was thinking Elena Catherine. Elena means bright light in Spanish, and I like the idea of naming her for the new life that began when you pulled me from that creek." Daniel's arm tightened around his wife's shoulders. "Elena Catherine McKay. I love it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Cattle lowing in the distance, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the whisper of wind through the oak trees Daniel had planted around the house. "Daniel," Catherine said softly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night? If you'd been somewhere else when the storm hit?" Daniel considered this. "I try not to think about it too much. The idea of you dying alone in that creek, it doesn't bear thinking about. But someone else might have found me. Some other rancher, some other good man who would have helped. Maybe," Daniel allowed, "but they wouldn't have been me. And you wouldn't have been you with them. What we have, Catherine, this specific love, this particular life we've built, it could only have happened between us." Catherine turned in his arms to face him fully. "You really believe that?" "I believe that some people are meant to find each other, regardless of the circumstances that bring them together. I believe you and I would have recognized something in each other, no matter how or when we met." Catherine kissed him then, tasting love and certainty and the promise of all their tomorrows. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "Mrs. McKay," Daniel said formally, "you have made me the happiest man in Colorado Territory." "Just Colorado Territory?" Catherine teased. "In all the territories, then. In the entire American West." "Better," Catherine said with satisfaction, "because you've made me the happiest woman in the entire world." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and the first cool breeze of evening stirred the air, Daniel and Catherine McKay prepared to head inside to their home, the home they'd built together with love, determination, and the absolute certainty that they'd found exactly where they belonged. The woman who'd once whispered, "I won't make it through the night," was now planning decades of nights with the man who'd refused to let her surrender. They'd found more than survival in each other. They'd found the kind of love that transforms ordinary days into extraordinary blessings and turns a simple ranch cabin into the center of the universe. Outside their door, Colorado Territory stretched vast and wild and full of possibilities. Inside, two hearts beat in rhythm, already anticipating the arrival of the new life that would carry their love into the future. And in the space between heartbeats, in the quiet moments before sleep, Catherine McKay offered a silent prayer of gratitude for floods and storms and all the beautiful disasters that had brought her home. Some rescues saved more than life. They saved the future itself, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one love at a time. And theirs would last forever. And there you have it, the incredible journey of Catherine Whitmore, who went from whispering her surrender in a flooding creek to building a life of love and purpose in the Colorado Territory. What strikes me most about Catherine's story is how it shows us that sometimes our darkest moments become the doorways to our greatest blessings. When she was dying in that creek, she couldn't imagine surviving the night, let alone finding happiness. But Daniel McKay saw something in her that she couldn't see in herself, the strength to not just survive, but to thrive. Daniel represents the kind of person we all need in our corner, someone who refuses to accept our surrender when we've given up on ourselves. He didn't rescue Catherine because she was helpless. He gave her the safety and support she needed to rescue herself. The American frontier was unforgiving, but it was also where people could reinvent themselves completely. Catherine transformed from a pampered city woman running from an arranged marriage into a confident rancher's wife who chose her destiny on her own terms. Her story reminds us that we're not defined by our circumstances, but by how we respond to them. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened. If you're brave enough to see the possibilities hidden in the wreckage. What would you have done in Catherine's situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible Wild West stories. Hit that notification bell because next week, the outlaw who became a preacher for love. Until then, remember, you're stronger than you know, and tomorrow always offers new chances. See you on the frontier.